As the forces of Nazi Germany raced across France in 1940, thousands of Channel Islanders decided to evacuate. Lasting 5 long years, their evacuation story is unlike any other.
French fishing boats were arriving in St. Peter Port with refugees from France.
They were in great need of food.
And thinking, oh, poor things, and never realising that that was going to happen to us.
I can remember distinctively my father saying that the airmen had advised him to pack and get out of the island.
When the Germans were progressing across France very rapidly, and my father was very concerned about this and wanted my mother and I to leave the island as soon as possible.
Yeah, the first we heard of the evacuation, or the intention to evacuate, was in the press on the 19th of June. They said that if you wanted to evacuate, you had to register that evening, so it was very, very quick.
On the Wednesday, we were all down at bathing pools. And the next thing was, there was all these lads coming running down, and they had these papers. And on it, we were going to be evacuated.
You didn't have to go, but if you wanted to go, especially if you were English or Jewish.
I could see the concern registering on my mother and father's face.
My mother decided that maybe the younger children should go. So we registered at the forest school and, on the 19th, and we were told that we'd had to report to leave for the harbour at 8 o'clock the following morning.
As far as we were concerned, it was all so rapid.
And when I got home, my mother was already packing for the 3 school children in our family. And she said, no, we're not going to stay because after what they've done in Poland, we couldn't possibly stay.
There was a bit of chaos because I can remember my mother and father having heated arguments about who should leave the family.
And Dad came home and Mum said, well, they're not going. Dad said they've got to go.
Well, when he saw the situation, he said, no, no way, you're going to stick as a family.
Well, in the meantime, Dad had come home and Mum told him. Anyway, she came up with Joy and I to the school, and there was all the mums there. And Mum said she wouldn't let us go unless she could come.
So I think we were the first ones that registered. In fact, my mother decided she'd come as a helper, and the children were put into groups. There were A's and B's and C's, so the first 9 that registered were A's, and my mother was in charge of the B's.
And the heartache at home, making the decision of to go or not to go.
Oh, they consulted me, though, and asked if I'd like to go. And I said, well, you know, who else is going? Well, your cousins are going and your school friends will be going. So you'll be all right and we'll come as soon as we're able to.
It was decided I would go and, as everybody said, and we will follow.
And we had an hour, Mum and I, to pack something. We could only take what we could carry.
We went home and Mum bathed us. She got some water going, bathed us, washed her hair, and that I remember so well because she said she didn't want us to go away being dirty.
My father came back and said, well, you've got 15 minutes to get on the bus.
Mum woke us up in the morning and said, right, it's time to go. And we were in the bus. We were allowed to go in the bus with the schools. Boys in some buses and girls in others.
Bye-bye, Mum, bye-bye, Dad. And that was it.
When I actually got to the boat, then I thought, oh, what's going to happen now? Where are we going?
Well, Dad went back to see to pick up my 2 older brothers and to see to the cattle. Because there was no next boat. He got stuck here.
Well, we waited on the new jetty, and ships came and ships went, and kids came and kids went. We were still there.
I don't know who it was, but somebody started singing "Wish Me Luck as You Wave Me Goodbye." And it's something I've never forgotten.
And I remember being ever so excited because I never left Guernsey. And I just thought of it as an adventure.
And we found a cabin which was full of people, and the boat was very dirty. I think it might have been to Dunkirk first.
There was blood on the walls, because I think it had just come from France.
And I think it was a coal boat because it was very dirty.
There was a Lewis gun on the deck. That there was a sailor or soldier, I don't know which, manning it, and we were all ready for any eventuality.
The journey was horrible. I was dreadfully seasick.
I was going to be sick and we had nothing to be sick in, so I used Mum's hat.
I remember going down into the hold and there were great piles of rope. We had to make ourselves as comfortable as we could.
My mother and I were sort of trying to sleep. Not that we felt much like sleeping. We cried so much, I think our eyes were so painful.
Wild rumours started circulating around the ship that somebody had sighted a submarine. They thought it was German.
So we all peered out through the rails looking for submarines, of course, didn't see anything.
But I do remember that part of the way across we were told that we couldn't go out on deck because there were German planes overhead, and they thought that if they saw a ship with children in that they would want to bomb it.
I felt that we were all in the same boat. All of us on that little boat going over with all our children, we were all in the same boat, helping one another. A lot of the younger ones thought they were on an outing. They didn't realise that they weren't going home. Sorry.
And I saw the white cliffs of England. I could plainly see the white horse carved out in the cliff in the field. It was then beautifully sunny, and the cliff looked lovely from the ship. And so this was England at last.
It was massive, after a small island.
And ladies from the WVS had waited for us to meet us. And they'd been practicing their French so they could greet us because they didn't think we spoke English.
And they were pleasantly surprised that we could speak the English. Well, they had these sandwiches ready for us and hot chocolate.
I remember we were all shepherded to this huge place, which I believe is called the Winter Gardens, and we had a cursory medical examination.
It was just to be checked over. They looked in our throat and up our noses, in our ears, and then they looked to see if our hair was clean, if we had anything, creepy crawlies in our hair.
And we got on the trains, and I saw my brothers and said, "You've got to come here with us," and the teacher says, "No, you're separated, boys in one lot, girls in another."
And I was quite excited because I was going on a train, and of course that for me as a 6-year-old was quite something.
It was that first sight of a steam engine. I mean, we'd only seen them in a book. The red and black engine with the big smoke coming out from between the wheels and out the stack. But to see it in real life, it was magic.
I remember we were all jammed into this compartment, great excitement. We'd never seen a train before.
We're given tea and sandwiches. We were very, very well catered for. It was marvellous, really, when you think of it.
The train was going along merrily, and I mean, the countryside, it was never ending.
But the first thing that shocked us was the sight of out of the train window of what was undeniably a cow, but it was black and white.
I'd never seen a black cow before.
Inconceivable to us that a cow should be anything other, but it's the reddy brown of the Guernsey cow.
And another thing too, I always thought next time we went over a hill I'd be able to see the sea.
And we were on the train all night. Now, we'd never been on a train before, and I can still hear the chewing. And every time we stopped from time to time, and we'd hear the men tapping the wheels. I mean, that was all completely new to us.
I don't think as children we knew exactly where we were going.
I sort of was having hallucinations because I got so tired. I was imagining a beautiful, comfortable bed, and I haven't slept for so long. But the Red Cross were very good and were bringing around what I always remember, digestive biscuits and cheese triangles.
The blinds had to be kept down for the blackouts. And of course, I can't remember going to sleep. And eventually we arrived at Derby.
And the headmaster came down and he said, oh, we're going to somewhere, I can't tell you where, but we're going to a place that's got a lot of cobbles. I think he thought I should know where this place was, but I didn't. Anyway, we arrived at Wigan.
But we ended up in Rochdale, and the thing that struck me most was the blackness of all the buildings. Never seen anything like that in my life, of course.
Arrived at Lancashire somewhere in the middle of the night, to a town called Burnley. Well, that was a bit of a cultural shock.
I can still see myself with my gas mask over my shoulder and my little cardboard suitcase, wondering what was going to happen.
And we were put into school halls. We went into the Methodist Central Hall.
The Stockport was where we finished up, you know, in a great big hall, incredible. And there was just rows and rows of mattresses and everything, and that's yours and that's yours, you know, and that was it.
We were in the school hall in this smallish village, and from there, I don't know how we were selected, but we were selected. And my brother and I were fortunate indeed to be billeted on the Vicar of Disley.
The word billeted at the time, we didn't know what the word meant.
And people sort of, for want of a better word, came to eye us up, really, and see which one they'd take and which one they wouldn't take.
We did sit around and people came in and looked at us, but of course because we were with my mother, she didn't want us to be separated. I think there was one person that wanted to take me, but she said, no, you take both of them or you don't take any of them.
But it was November by this time, so we had been pushed from pillar to post, really, from June to November. And honestly, I think I was still wearing the same clothes that I'd gone away with.
We were gradually left behind. They wanted girls. They didn't want two little ruffians like us. So we were the last ones virtually there. Right? And this woman came along and she took pity on us and she said, I'll have those two.
Very kindly people would come to take children to billet them in their homes. And we were so rude to these people. We were determined we'd never get split up.
I was very fortunate, actually. I was chosen by some people called Pickford, as in Pickfords.
Excuse my sort of Lancashire, they said, now they know us, lad, that they know us, that Thailand's occupied by now. So we said, yeah. Well, by now, probably Nazis have killed our parents. So I can't have two of you forever. So you, Michael, are going with Mrs. Smith, you see.
I was greeted with great enthusiasm by the farmer's wife. She was rather a well-built lady and said she'd always wanted a son.
The door opened and this big lady with a big bosom appeared at the door and she said, oh, hello! And she grabbed me like this and I was lost in her bosom. And I could smell the cooking and the heat coming from the house, you know? And that was at that moment that I thought, right, I'm going to be all right, you know?
My mother came and took me away. She said, you know, I've got a house now, so you can come and live with me. I would have preferred to stay with the Pickfords.
Not all the school children were as lucky as me to have had a good billet.
Every place you went to wasn't very nice.
There was already a crowd of children there. And it was dreadful. The house was filthy.
They said, their little girl's name is Brenda. And she said, well, you can't be called Brenda, so I had to be called Muriel. And that, again, took my identity away from me.
He said he was well fed and well clothed, but he had to get up, take her a breakfast in bed every morning. He wouldn't allow him to leave for school till 10 minutes before, and to get to school on time, he had to literally run.
I think they must have been under contract to keep you for 3 months, but in the 15 months I changed 5 times. So I had 5 different billets for 3 months before somebody got hold of me and steadied me down. Why I was transferred so often, what I was doing, I can't tell you because I simply don't remember. But things just didn't work out 5 times, presumably. And I doubt if it was the foster parents' fault all the time.
They never hit me, but they were very, I can't say, I had no love or anything, no affection for me at all.
But she used to belt the life out of him. I mean, the week didn't go by without him having a good hiding for the least little thing. He used to get down on the floor so that she couldn't, you know, she couldn't put the same force on it.
I was hit again and I thought, what is going on?
He was worried that if anything happened to his parents while he was away, that he might have to stay with them. And he just lived in dread of that.
My mother was in Bolton, and we didn't know it. And that was the 1.5 minute bus ride away from Wigan. An elder brother went up to Glasgow. His school, that was St Sampson's school. And Mum found him quick. And he went to live with her. Took her 6 months to find us.
Oh, the village people were very hostile at first. They'd never heard of the Channel Islands, let alone Guernsey. Never heard of the Channel Islands, and they thought we were from another planet, I think.
It was probably unfortunate that we were in Bournemouth because it, in those days, was a very snooty place.
We were foreigners to some.
She'd been on the bus with another Guernsey person. They were talking patois. And she said, the look she's got, she said, because we didn't realise. She said, we're so used to talking it.
It was our language. Patois was what we spoke.
Nous disions français tout le temps. Nous étions comme des étrangers. We were like foreigners.
There was a time when one landlady said, no, I certainly won't take you in because you're refugee scum.
Oh, they were hostile. They didn't know where the Channel Islands were.
One of our neighbours actually did not speak to my mother for the first 2 years we lived there.
The first winter there, 1940, we had snow, which we thought was nice. But once the snow had fallen and that, and we found it was really cold, and of course, we didn't have the clothes for it.
The winters were very, very harsh in England, up in the north anyway, on the Cheshire Plain.
Well, of course, the snow in the winter was terrific, very deep.
And it was a white Christmas. And of course, we'd made up little things for the children.
As it so happened, there was a fall of snow. And he said, come along, wake up, Father Christmas has been. And so we looked out the window and there was this rails where you could see the sledge and marks where the hoofs of the reindeers were. And he got all the evacuee kids up and we all gawked at this thing. And he sort of said, I'm sorry, I don't know whether there's many presents.
Our first Christmas in England, we had sausages. That was Christmas lunch, because that was all we could get. And we had boiled potatoes and sausages and some peas or something from somebody. And we were all thinking about what it had been like 12 months earlier.
For the boys, I managed to get them a little toy gun each. I can't remember what I got the girl. But for the ladies, I got them a tablet of soap and a box of matches. And that's what it amounted to at Christmas time.
You know, they didn't allow the children to play with your children. Just one or two would pick out But that's how it was really right through. They didn't really want the children to mix with us. I think they thought we were sort of gypsies or something.
I hated the school because the teacher, I mean, my first teacher I remember there was a Mr. Smith, and he wore this black robe, and they did geometry and algebra, which we didn't have in Guernsey.
Again, there was a diverse number of people there. They came from Birmingham, from Coventry, from London even, and ourselves, and the locals didn't like any of us. Sitting 3 to a 2-seater desk, and a very old teacher of whatever sex waving a stick about and telling us all to be quiet. And for the first 18 months or so I was at that school, I don't think I learnt a thing.
We did barricade some local boys in the barn once, I think we were. Because I suppose there was a bit of them and us.
And it was one of the most traumatic, ghastly experiences of my life. I've never looked back since then, once I survived that first term, of the bad food and the bullying and the cold.
And I didn't like it. They used to call me Froggy. One teacher especially.
And I can always remember Mr. Smith standing me in front of the class and saying, "You've spoilt my class." And I didn't understand why. But it was because I was the only one that hadn't had the strap.
There were no teachers to move on to, so the poor nun who was teaching me, Sister Cecil, she was teaching me for 5 years, so it was a bit hard on her, I thought. To have a book that, you know, everybody could have one of. We had The Wind in the Willows, and we did everything for The Wind in the Willows. You know, we did dictation from The Wind in the Willows. We did our literature from The Wind in the Willows. We adapted The Wind in the Willows to plays so as we could do our drama from The Wind in the Willows.
I'd have been 14 when we left Guernsey and old enough to leave school. And whilst I've regretted it for the rest of my life, at the time I thought this was wonderful.
I went to school only for a few months because in January 1941 I was age 14 and left school. And I was put in engineering as an apprentice engineer.
The evacuees had what they call assistance board. But when any of the children left school, whatever they earned was deducted from the assistance board, so Mum was never any better off.
No, it was a hard life really because, well, you didn't have any money and a big family.
We were living on benefits basically. I think they called it public assistance, which I heard Mum say was just about enough to keep body and soul together.
They were demanding that you do war work at that age, and we all went together to the labour exchange, a few of us, and we were directed into factory work, and that was an aircraft factory, and we were making Spitfire tips, wing tips.
We made parts for planes and parts for boats, for ships, you know, for the war. It was a big place.
I was offered a job in Boots Library, brilliant. And I was very happy there and had all the books I wanted and a very nice staff. I didn't realise there were another 2 or 3 years to come, but I thought I mustn't let them forget me. So every time we had a territorial general manager or a head librarian or somebody down, I used to say, "Oh, I'm the one who wants to transfer to Guernsey."
I miss my friends, my relatives, the outings that we used to do, and the sea. Because we never saw the sea all the time we were in Glasgow.
I haunted Poole Harbour and I sat there looking at the sea and the boats and listening to the seagulls, and it was almost Guernsey.
The first bomb I ever heard drop was a screaming bomb. And it dropped at the end of our road.
For a time, we used to come home from school, have a meal, and then we'd go into the air raid shelter and we'd spend the night there.
We were like sardines in a tin when it was going to bed, but we were together.
The only time we mixed with the family, because we ate in the kitchen, they ate in the dining room, was during the air raid, because we were in the shelter together.
I was listening. I thought to myself, I wonder where it's going to drop. And it did eventually drop and move my bed about 6 inches from the wall. And that made me jump, I can tell you. I was out of that bed like a shot.
Within, I expect, 300 or 400 yards of us, then there were people killed because the bombs came down.
An air raid happened to come on the 12th of October 1941, the day of the daughter's 10th birthday. And as we heard the sirens, we heard the bomb coming down. And that bomb was destined to land outside our front door.
One of my school friends was killed in a bomb raid. Their house was struck.
Next thing I knew, I was under the debris of the house. I came to after some time, I don't know how long, and I was dug out eventually by the firemen. The boy in bed with me was killed.
I think a bomb dropped either side of us, but some distance, and we had windows out and slates falling off the roof, but it was nothing, although we invariably slept in the shelter, and we'd already lost our home, so we didn't have the sort of affection for the building we were living in.
A couple of days later, they brought John, my twin, to see me at Great Hucklow. And because I was really in shock, I think, at that time. I didn't know what shock was, I suppose, really. But I was in shock because my mother had written a letter saying that John was dead. And I read this letter saying that John was dead, and I assumed it was my twin. But after I'd read it a few times, I realised it wasn't this John. It was John of the house.
The siren went off at night, and gunfire kept us awake night after night after night.
His mother in the front room of the house was killed as well. She died soon after the raid was completed. The husband, Mr. Hughes, was stood by the front door, and the bomb landed really just outside, but was the angle of the blast. It blew the front of the house and the roof, etc. And the institute opposite the house was just demolished totally.
And we heard this bomb come down, and we really thought it was going to hit us.
Bombing and things like that, they didn't stop you from, you know, going on holiday or travelling. And I'd go through Euston where it had been bombed, but it just carried on.
I think we lived just from day to day, really. We just lived in hopes that it would soon end.
Eventually we made friends with the local people, and we were invited to a lot of tea parties.
Yeah, I made a lot of friends. Once I started work, in fact, one of the friends that I started work with, she left school at the same time as me, we're still friends to this day.
You couldn't get friendlier people than in the north of England.
We had a Channel Islands Society, which we used to go to.
And the idea was that I think if there was anybody in great trouble, then the society could get in touch with the Refugee Society in London and they could be helped.
And I remember that we went once or twice to Birmingham to meet the Channel Islands Society in Birmingham.
We used to have all sorts of things. We'd organise dances.
There were proper little information magazines issued in some places.
There was a little bulletin used to be printed.
It was wonderful sort of meeting up with Guernsey people, and they were very popular.
And that was the only way we could get information. We weren't having any Red Cross letters from Guernsey.
And we had a membership card, and we met and we exchanged any bits of news about the Channel Islands. There wasn't much, and we looked at each other's Red Cross messages, which were wonderful.
About once a month we'd have a Red Cross letter, 25 words.
We didn't write the message ourselves, it was written on this Red Cross form. And we sent one, I sent one in November, and it was March before I received a reply, so it's quite a long time.
They were able to tell us what messages they'd had, we were able to pass on any messages to them, so we could keep up with the hatched, matched and dispatched in Guernsey to a certain degree.
I was so excited to get this message. I took it to work and I showed it to everybody, and everybody wanted to read it, of course.
The situation, we knew from the tone of the letters that we were getting, was getting worse.
I didn't hear anything for 18 months because we didn't know we could send Red Cross messages. And my mum thought I was dead.
There were only 25 words allowed, and it took a long time for these messages to go backwards and forwards. But one became very clever at wording messages, so you were conveying an awful lot.
But it was nice because we knew that everything was still all right with them.
And Uncle Tom came with a letter, and it had a big Red Cross mark on it. And the letter was to say that my parents had been deported from Guernsey to Germany.
I think they were getting information from the people who were sent to the camps.
Now, my mother's brother, being English, was deported to Laufen. And once he went to Laufen, we then had proper letters. Whereas before, we'd only had the 25-word Red Cross messages. So we had far more news from my uncle, who's in Germany, than we could get from Guernsey itself.
Guernsey to Germany, Germany to England and back.
Of course, everybody, including the adults, they only thought it would be for a few weeks, you know, away from home, not 5 long years.
Nobody can understand what it's like to be away for 5 years and come back.
They didn't think when they were sending their children away that they weren't going to see them for 5 years. I think there'd been quite a lot of people would have reacted differently if they'd thought of that. Yeah.
I'm sure if they'd known that it was going to be for 5 years, they wouldn't have sent me.
I went away with my label on me, but I don't think I had a photograph of my parents. And over that period of time, it had certainly got very hazy. You know, I knew that they were alive and well, and they knew that I was alive and well. But of course, as the years went by, my memories of them over a 5-year period very much dimmed.
I was sitting in the cinema with Mrs. Harris, and the big cheer went up.
Into the harbour of St. Peter Port on Guernsey in the Channel Islands steams a British warship with the white ensign flying. A tumultuous welcome awaits the liberators of the islands. Incidentally, the oldest British possession and the only British territory to be occupied by the Germans during the war.
I do remember Churchill's speech when our dear Channel Islands also to be free today, and of course they weren't free till the next day.
As I say, I had switched on the wireless in the morning, and this voice came on saying that the Channel Islands, that the war was over, and Mr. Churchill's speech to say that our dear Channel Islands would be freed.
And I said to the girls in the shop, I said, I'm going home.
Oh, we were hysterical. I think one of them kicked the radio. He did something. We went hysterical, really. We were telling one another, we're free, we're free.
When we heard about the liberation, it was fantastic. I cried.
My mother, who was standing next to me, screamed. She was so thrilled because her parents were in Guernsey.
Couldn't believe it.
But I did think, right, go home tomorrow, and I was amazed at how long it took.
Because I thought it was the next day, but it wasn't. It was quite a few months later.
I was so excited, and then all of a sudden, it just dawned on me, oh, I'll be seeing my mum and dad and my sister, and then I dawned, and yet I'll be leaving these people, you know? And Mandy gave me a big cuddle and said, oh, you know, we'll be losing you, you know?
But I really got integrated into life in Rochdale, particularly when I was working. And at one stage I thought perhaps I wouldn't return to Guernsey. Then when everybody started saying, oh, I'm going home, I thought, yes, I haven't seen my father and everybody, I must go.
And I was hiding behind Auntie Jessie, and when they walked up the garden path, I said, that's not them. I said, that's not my mum and dad. Oh, but it is. I said, well, I don't think so. But of course it was. And I really didn't want to come back to Guernsey.
But she took me, her and Uncle took me to the station, but they couldn't stand by the train, so they hid. And I kept saying, I wonder where Auntie was. I'd like to say it, but she was so choked she couldn't come and say cheerio to me, you know.
All I could dream about was coming home. And of course, we couldn't come home on our own accord. We had to wait.
We were free in the May, and this was October, and all our friends were getting back.
The people have been very good to me in Glasgow, and I'd had a good time, but the thought of coming home, that was it. I couldn't wait to get on the boat.
By the time it was liberated, I had taken the 11 plus, and I'd literally just won a scholarship to a grammar school. He just saw this as my career and said, we're not going home, Elaine. And she said, yes, Frank.
Even though we were teenagers, elderly teenagers, we still had to come back with the school party.
By the time we left there, sort of 8 years after, I think it must have been, my mother had the house furnished from top to bottom and had to leave it all again and make her third home.
And the family was in tears for a long time because she wanted to go back to her sisters and her mother and so on.
We came back on, as I say, on the Antonia. Tony and I stayed on deck. It was bitterly cold.
It was a long journey home because had to skirt minefields and all that sort of thing, and then we arrived home early morning.
And looking at Guernsey, and if we've ever seen Guernsey bathed in the early morning sunlight.
And to see those islands, it's a wonderful feeling.
We got into Guernsey at about 6. It was a fine morning, sun was rising.
And even as we got off, you could see the number of people that were so thin, the adults and the elderly people, not children.
That was great, really great. Home again.
And I saw my grandfather and my father. They were big men, very tall men. And I saw them straight away, but the thing that struck me was how thin they were.
I knew my father straight away, I recognised him, but we could, at our age, we could remember him, where the younger ones of the family didn't know who this stranger was.
I recognised my dad didn't recognise me.
I was waving to my mum, but she didn't recognise me. I could recognise her and Dad, but she couldn't recognise me. She just didn't know who I was.
And there was Dad on the quay, his clothes hanging on him a bit, some of his teeth missing. A strange man now, as 5 years had gone.
When we first came back, they were detonating bombs and things. They kept a lot of the Germans here to say where they'd put various things, and that was being detonated. It was quite noisy.
It was unusual, to say the least, because we had only then seen Germans on film. And so they were still here for about 18 months, but under escort.
German soldiers were still around clearing up when we came back. And, you were still in the war, if you like.
We found it very, very difficult because my father hated the Germans.
But I've also found it very strange coming from a big city. You know, where everything was going on, and coming back to an island where there was very little doing, you know.
Nowadays, if somebody's away for 10 days or held in captivity, they have to have counselling forever. And all you did was pick up your parents and Went home for breakfast.
I could get low. I could, because things weren't as I thought they were going to be.
When we first came back, I was in bed at nights and I could hear my mum crying and my dad trying to comfort her, you know. And I remember one night hearing him saying, well, I'll give her the money tomorrow and she can, for her fare, and she can go back. If this is going to be the life you're going to lead, well, it's not worth it, you know. She might just as well go back.
They didn't know what I was saying, and my ways was all different from their ways, so it was like starting to adjust again.
And then I thought, oh, I'm being terrible, you know, I'm being awful. But I didn't mean to be awful, I just was not happy.
The worst thing for Dad, really, at that time was to understand all the dialects. Pam came from Wales, Alf came from Derbyshire, two of us came from Lancashire, and one from, or two from Cheshire with Mum.
My relationship with my parents never really recovered totally from the war years.
How my mother got on with my father after that long absence, I don't know. Afterwards, she told me that it was very, very difficult to resume the relationship that had been so abruptly cut off.
Because I'd been used to living in billets, you could have pointed me at any two people in the school playground, and I would have gone and lived with them, because that's what you did.
Relationship with my father, no, it never really fully recovered again.
It wasn't an easy time, and there had to be adjustments on both sides, and my memory of it is that it went well.
It was a wee bit difficult because we were all separated and we all had to learn to live together.
I mean, I was a 16-year-old, and as a 16-year-old I thought I was 18. My mum knew I was 16, but thought I must be only 11.
It wasn't the same attitude that we had towards him as we had at the time we left. We felt we'd grown, we were experienced, and that we felt, well, certainly more mature.
Eventually we settled down, you know, and then of course you had to start making friends again.
There was a lot of reunions, and that was lovely.
Catching up with old friends and all the news and that was lovely.
But we all found it a job to settle.
People had already formed their friends, and it wasn't as easy to pick up links, I don't think, with people that we had known before the war.
We felt very bitter about the war because we'd heard of the awful things going on in Europe. Where here, people had lived with the forces, and I believe they behaved extremely well in the island, providing people behaved and stuck to their rules.
It almost divided people, really.
And the relationships, when they came back after, were damaged.
He said we ran away.
I think at first there was a sort of them and us feeling.
There was a conversation usually of, did you go away or did you stay? And you became almost like two different sides, you know.
Well, Edwin was in his uniform and he went to, this was after the war, we went to a pub along the front and they wouldn't serve him. You see, Edwin only went because I was going and he said, I'll join up. And I said, no, it was nobody's fault, it was just the war. There's a big division yet with the ones who left and the ones who stayed.
I can't say that I was ecstatic to be home, because I wasn't.
It made us grow up very quick, became very independent. It split so many families up in more ways than one.
It all seems a dream now.
It's really something special for people to open their hearts and their homes.
Sometimes it seems like a dream, it's never happened.
But it was 5 wasted years for everybody.
Certainly it dragged Guernsey kicking and screaming into the 20th century. It really did change it for everyone.
I realised how awful I'd been to my parents when I came back.
But I wouldn't let my children go through it.
The other week I was in my granddaughter's house. I said, how would you like to leave all that? And he'd join up and he'd go away. Oh, never, never. Well, I said, it happened to me. I said, and I was only 20. I said, please God, it never happens to you. My sister-in-law were Guernsey born, you see. And when they used to say, oh, it's the sound of the sea, and I don't know what they're talking about. And when I came back, and we landed in Guernsey, and this swish, I was like, oh. I said, I see what you mean now. They're all gone now. There's only me left. Now, when I hear the sea, I think of them, you know.
We're still thinking that the answer to our problems is to go to war, and I think that's very, very sad. We just don't learn.